very good evening to all of you. I welcome you all once again to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We will start today with a very touching story that I found in the Hindu newspaper today. It was about the migrant workers in a village in Rajasthan. These migrant workers were quarantined by the villagers in a public school, and they were given good food and all the essential items, and all such facilities were given by the people to these migrant workers. Even medical teams had visited, and they had done a regular checkup of these migrant workers. The migrant workers were so much moved by this act of benevolence of the people in the village that they saw that the school building was in shambles, and therefore they decided to um, remove it out of its bad shape. So they deployed their skills, they painted the school, and they are trying to reshape the building. So here it shows what two important lessons that I learned from this story is that firstly, if we show love to people, then we will also be loved back. Here the villagers, they were so loving enough and caring enough to offer all these basic facilities to the migrant workers by empathizing with what the migrant workers were going through. So this shows empathy on part of the people to offer all these facilities to these migrant workers at a time of crisis like this. And secondly, from the point of view of these migrant workers, what it shows is the level of gratitude that they have towards these villages who took care of them at the time of crisis. When they could not meet their families and they were breaking down emotionally, at that point of time, these villagers were the ones who helped these migrant workers. So it shows the immense amount of gratitude that these people have for whoever has helped them. Also, we see that there is a saying that if you want to test a person's character, put that person into adversity. So the way a person behaves in adversity shows his true character. So here both the sides were facing the crisis, but the way they have come together and they have reciprocated the care that they have shown to each other shows that these are all people of strong character also. So these are the three important lessons that I learned from this story. With this, we'll move on to the first of the day, which is about the post-retirement appointment of the judges. So, so the editorial first of all says that in the recent there have been many cases recently where the judges have been appointed to executive posts after their retirement, and that is very soon after their retirement, which has given rise to questions on the independence of judiciary. So firstly, the article talks about the independence of the judiciary, which has been provided for on the constitution. So part 5 and part 6 of the constitution talk about the Supreme Court and the high courts. The procedure for removal of the judges has been made so stringent so as to ensure the independence of the judiciary. And also independence of the judiciary forms a part of the basic structure of our constitution, which cannot be altered. So this is very important principle that is followed in the constitution. But however, we have seen in the recent times that judges have been accepting some plum posts by the executive. So when we see that several examples, for instance, former Chief Justice of India Sathasivan was appointed as the Governor of Kerala, and before the appointment, when Sathasivan was serving, it was seen that he had given some judgments in favor of the government. For example, here the judge had cleared a politician in a fake encounter case. So it was seen that this appointment as a Governor of Kerala post retirement was to reward the judge for a favorable judgment. And similarly, recently we have the former CJI Ranjan Gogoi also being nominated by the president as a member of Rajya Sabha also. And here again, it is pointed out that the judge had presided over cases, important ones like the Ayodhya verdict or the Rafale verdict. So therefore it is said that and all these decisions were also in favor of the government. So it is again it has raised eyebrows whether this was a reward for the favor rendered by the judge in delivering favorable judgments. And this, the appointment as the member of the Rajya Sabha has come only months after the retirement of the judge. So this has these instances have raised the questions on the independence of judiciary. Even apart from this, there have been several other instances. Like for example, there is Justice A.K. Goel. So A.K. Goel was appointed the chairman of the National Green Tribunal on the same day of the retirement. So this shows that the decision about appointing him as a chairman of NGT was already made in principle even before the judge retiring. So this shows that even before that the judge was lured off a position after the retirement. So all of these possibilities are there. And in this case, A.K. Goel justice was actually dealing with a case on restructuring of the tribunals itself. So these cases have been pointed out, and this shows how independence of judiciary could be affected. So in this regard, we will talk about some of the issues that this is giving rise to. The first thing is the constitutional issue. The constitution says, in this case, for instance, when the Ranjan Gogoi justice was appointed as a member of Rajya Sabha, the constitution says that president can nominate persons who are having special knowledge in literature, science, art, social service as members of Rajya Sabha. So where a judge will fit in this is again unclear. So it has raised constitutional issues also. And also one of the most important constitutional value is having impartiality in the dispensation of justice. But this again goes against that. Secondly, it is also against the separation of power doctrine, where an ex-judge occupies an executive post. So this is also against the separation of power doctrine. The third thing is it undermines the confidence of the public in the judiciary. When such doubts and suspicions are raised over the post-retirement appointment of the judges, this will undermine the confidence of people in the judiciary and also in the constitutional democracy. There is a famous saying that it is not just important for justice to be done, but it is equally important that the justice must be seen to be done. Even people should see that justice is being done. So when such kind of appointments happen, the people don't see that justice is being done, and they will lose that confidence on the judicial system of the country. So this is another issue that it is giving rise to. And also, fourthly, government is a major litigant. So when government is a major litigant and several of the government cases are being decided by the judges, by luring them with regard to post-retirement jobs, it is very much possible to make the judge deliver a favorable judgment for the government. So this is again unethical from the point of view of government, and also from the point of view of judge, it leads to conflict of interest. So whose interest should he serve? So it gives rise to this problem as well. And when we talk about all these things, we will also see few supporting data. For example, the Vidhi Center for Legal Policy, in 2016, it observed that out of the 100 last judges who retired from the Supreme Court, 70 of them, that is, they retired from the Supreme Court before February 2016. So the last 100 judges who retired from the Supreme Court as of February 2016, 70 of them had accepted post-retirement job. But however, there are several laws in the country which mandates the appointment of judges to certain posts, like tribunals, some commissions and all. So they mandate the appointment of judges. So 56% of these appointments, post-retirement appointments, were because a law mandated it that a judge must be appointed to a particular post. So this shows that there is an inherent structural problem itself, because the law itself is mandating the appointment of the judges. So there is a structural problem. So this is one thing that we have to note. And also even the law commission, in the 14th report, as way back in 1958 itself, it has told that there must not be the post-retirement jobs for the judges either under the central government or the state government. It is possible that there will be a quid pro quo, that is, the government may seek a favorable judgment in its favor, and in return, the government may offer some good post-retirement jobs to the judge. So this quid pro quo harms the judicial independence, and therefore these judges of the Supreme Court should not be employed either under the state or the central government. So this was the view of the Law Commission in its 14th report itself. So in this regard, we can take note of some of the international practice, like for example in the United States, the Supreme Court judges, they never retire at all. So they don't retire. And even in the UK, even when the judges retire, they retire at a higher age of 70 years. So after this, even though there is no specific law which prohibits their employment, but after an age of 70 years, no judge has till date sought any post-retirement employment as such. And when you also see from the other side, that is, several people also say that it is good to appoint the judges after their retirement. This is because they have a very valuable and a rich experience and insights which could be used for nation building. And also the judges in India retire at a comparatively younger age itself. So and they will still be capable of much more productive work even after retirement, and that shouldn't go waste. But we have already seen various issues it gives rise to when this happens. So therefore it is better that when we move forward, we keep these international best practices in mind. And also another solution that is suggested is through a statute, through a legislation, we must form a commission, and this commission can also comprise of all the retired judges, and it is this commission that should make the appointments of for the judges who are retired. So it should make these appointments, it should appoint only the competent of these retired judges to various tribunals and judicial bodies. So this commission should have the power to decide who is competent enough to be appointed to tribunals and other judicial bodies. This could also be done, and even the Second Administrative Reforms Commission has recommended that when post-retirement appointments of the judges can be there, but there has to be a 2-year cooling off period. So when 2-year cooling off period is there, it is less likely that the judges will be lured by some offer of some appointment today, when it is going to come to them only after a period of 2 years, when nobody is even sure which government is going to come to power tomorrow. So this cooling off period will also help the judges to remain independent and to ensure judicial independence. So with this, we will move to the next topic. It is about the Reliance Facebook deal. So here Facebook has is buying nearly 9.9, and that is 10% nearly stake in the Reliance's digital platform, which is called as a Jio platform. So Facebook is buying nearly 10% stake in Jio platform, and it has sealed this deal at about $5.7 billion, while the Jio platform itself is valued at nearly $66 billion. So now why this deal has come about and what each of these people will gain, we will just analyze that. So first we will consider the Reliance. What is its advantage with this deal? So it is basically FDI. So this is a foreign direct investment of Facebook in Reliance. So what is Reliance going to gain? First of all, Reliance has in its balance sheet, it has several debts which it wants to clear, and it also had committed that within 18 months it would be a zero net debt company. So therefore, when Facebook is bringing this FDI, it is going to reduce its debts also. The second thing is about the timing. So this is the most opportune time to strike this deal, because now online platform for ordering of essential goods has seen an upsurge. So before COVID, just 1% of 80,000 crore online grocery market in India was there. But now this has become, the online grocery market has become more than 50% today. So this timing was very opportune to strike this deal. The third is that Facebook already, in the form of WhatsApp already has more than 400 million users. So Reliance can leverage this customer and the user base of WhatsApp for its own purposes. So Jio can promote its services to even users of Jio's rivals, because now Reliance will have access to the Facebook. And again, through this, what will happen is even the customers are going to benefit. So what is the benefit for the customers? Nearly from 3 crore kirana shops across the country, they will be able to get their goods and products and services. So which means that this is going to reduce the response time for the customers after they order something, and they will get a quicker and a faster delivery. And it is also going to support these small kirana stores, which are more than 3 crore in number. So it is going to help them also to join this technology bandwagon and to be able to reach a larger number of customers at their own level. So it is going to help the customers also. And apart from that, even Facebook is going to help, because even Facebook is going to be helped by this deal, because first of all, it will mark the entry of the Facebook in the Indian telecom space. And Facebook had been time and again trying to enter into the Indian telecom space, either previously through the free basics, or the Facebook even tried to beam free internet from air using solar powered drones called as Aquilas. So this marks an entry of Facebook in the Indian telecom space. The second thing is that Jio has been offering very cheap data to its users. So because of which today there are 388 million Jio online users. So again, Facebook can leverage this user base of Jio also. Third is this helps Facebook to navigate the regulatory environment in India. When it tried to introduce free basics, or when it tried to introduce WhatsApp Pay and all, it faced a lot of skirmishes with respect to the regulatory environment in India. So this also Facebook can use this to help navigate the regulatory environment in India, because this it is striking as in the form of a deal. And also Reliance itself has several apps. For example, Jio Money is there, or Jio TV is there. So Facebook can have access to all these things also now to grow. And even Reliance has acquired several young startups, for example, in the fields of logistics, e-commerce, and artificial intelligence. So Facebook will have access to these young startups also, which have been acquired by Reliance or its subsidiaries. And yes, so these are the impact of this deal on first Reliance, second on Facebook, on the kirana stores, and on the consumers. So this is how many times when you're asked to analyze a particular thing, the impact of a particular thing, you can think of the various stakeholders, and from all their points you can analyze, so that you don't miss out on any aspect. So when you consider Reliance, Facebook, the kirana stores, and the consumers, you don't have anybody left out. And when you categorize points in these among these four stakeholders, you will never miss out any important dimension, an important aspect. So this is how to go about it. We will now go to the next topic. These are a few examples of e-technology. In the field of education, IIT Tirupati has started online classes as soon as even before the lockdown. It sent its students to the different states to which they belonged, and it started taking classes as way back as in March itself, using the flipped classroom model. So this is the utility of e-technology in the field of education. Similarly, e-technology in governance, where in the Twitter, government has started this COVID India Seva page, where citizens can post queries and they can get answers to these queries on almost at real times. So this is an example of e-governance delivery on a real-time basis. So these are the two examples. So like education and governance, I have already repeatedly told, you must have examples ready for health and for vulnerable sections, for everything ready. So we go to the next topic, which is the role of statutory bodies. This is a part of the syllabus in GS2, which talks about constitutional statutory bodies. So here it talks about the role of NHRC. So NHRC, yesterday itself I had asked a question about the analyzing the functioning of the NHRC in protecting human rights in India. So NHRC has recently issued a notice to the DGP of Palghar because of the mob lynching that happened there. Three people were lynched by the mob in Palghar district. So NHRC has given a notice to the DGP regarding this because when this lynching happened, first of all, it happened during the lockdown where not many people are there on the streets. Second, there were so many police personnel there. And the lynching happened right under their nose. It was not there. So NHRC has given a notice saying that it amounts to negligence by the public servants. So that is why it has served a notice that because of this it has affected the right to life of these victims. So this is the role example of the role that the NHRC can play in protecting the human rights. Now there was a small data on remittance. The World Bank has released a report saying COVID-19 crisis through a migration lens. So this is the name of the report. And in this report, it has said that the global remittance is going to fall by 20%. And even in India, the remittance is going to fall by 23%. So it was 83 billion last year, and this year it is going to be 64 billion. It is projected to be 64 billion this year. So there is a 23% fall in the remittance in India. So this is the data by World Bank in its COVID-19 crisis through a migration lens report. So we will discuss yesterday's question on NHRC. So in the introduction, of course, you are going to tell that NHRC is a statutory body. It was established in 1993 through the Protection of Human Rights Act, and it's basically a human right watchdog. So all the basic introduction is going to be given, and then we talk about the issues. So when we talk of the issues, you can categorize it as within the NHRC, what are all the issues, and then outside of the NHRC, from the environment, what it faces, the issues. So the first thing is that NHRC has only recommendatory powers. So it has no powers to enforce its directions. So its recommendations, they are only advisory, and they cannot be enforced. All right. And secondly, this is one thing. And second thing is that a lot of the amount that is allocated to NHRC is going off in their administrative expenses itself. So this means that not much of money is left for doing research in the field of human rights or creating awareness to the people. All of that is not happening. So thirdly, the people who are getting posted to the NHRC are usually done on deputations and all. So the environment within the NHRC is similar to any other government department. So that is another issue with respect to this. And so similarly, you can list issues which are within the NHRC and outside NHRC, and also it depends upon the powers that have been assigned to the NHRC. The law itself says that it cannot investigate any complaint which has been received more than 1 year after the occurrence of the incident. So several genuine incidents would have happened, and there have been some genuine hardships to report that incident within a period of 1 year. But even in those cases, NHRC cannot investigate into cases which have occurred more than 1 year before. Also, as I said, that its powers are recommendatory or advisory in nature. You can give some examples. For example, in the Red Sanders case in Sheshachalam, where the encounter took place. So there NHRC recommended that it has to be given for a CBI inquiry, but the state government didn't accept it, and NHRC couldn't do anything about it. Similarly, there have been previous cases of the Best Bakery case, the Bilkis Bano case. Even in all these cases, NHRC has recommended for a CBI inquiry, but the governments have denied it, and it couldn't do anything about that. So this is also there. And then again, when it comes to power, the NHRC, the act does not extend to Jammu and Kashmir. So the whole lot of human right violations that are happening in Jammu and Kashmir will be outside of the purview of NHRC. And thirdly, its power when it comes to the armed forces is very limited. So it's when it comes to the armed forces, the powers of NHRC is very limited. It cannot call for any evidence or call for any witness. All that it cannot be done by NHRC. And also, again, when it comes to the power, the Human Rights Act, it doesn't categorically empower the NHRC to act where the human right violations are done by a private party. So that for that the NHRC is not empowered to do that. So this is there. And then again, when it comes to the issues within the NHRC, you can talk about a lot of vacancies. The vacancies in the NHRCs are high, because of which the pendency of the cases is also high. So this is also there. And there is also a conflict of interest when it comes to the second ARC has observed that several times this NHRC, when it gives a report to the Ministry of Home Affairs, and several of these reports, they talk about the violation of human rights by the police on the inmates or the accused. But again, Ministry of Home is the parent ministry for the police as well. So how far Ministry of Home can act on the police when NHRC is giving reports on human right violations by the police, when Ministry of Home itself is a parent ministry for the police? So these issues are also there. But however, it doesn't mean that NHRC is not doing any work. You also have to highlight several positive work that is done by NHRC. For example, in the case of now the migrant workers, it is considering the issue seriously. You can quote the Spalgar incident. Similarly, you can quote the jail reforms. Because of NHRC, the hygiene, the sanitation, and the food in the jails have improved. And it has also been successful in creating awareness about the human rights among the public. For example, when the NHRC was constituted in 1993-94, the number of complaints it received was just 169. Whereas in 2015-16, the number of complaints it received was 1,17,800. So this shows that NHRC has been fairly successful in creating awareness among the public about the human rights. And also it has done a research in the field of human rights. In the case of Salwa Judum, it has been successful. Then NHRC had also issued some guidelines regarding the custodial death, that whenever a death occurs in the police station, it has to be reported to the NHRC within 48 hours. Now there is a strict inspection on all of these things that are happening. So there have been, even when it comes to the child labor again, and also the mentally health people, mentally ill people. Regarding all of these cases, the NHRC has been fighting. Even the LGBT community also, NHRC has been fighting, and there have been little success regarding the LGBT rights. So you have to highlight some of the success as well. And when it comes to conclusion, you can recommend some measures which can make the NHRC stronger. For example, whenever a state is not accepting the recommendation of NHRC, it has to send a report as to why the recommendation is not accepted, and when it has accepted, it may send an action taken report. Then there is also a need to include more civil society members and human rights activists as part of the NHRC. We may also even considering giving NHRC a constitutional status so that it becomes more stronger. Because remember, once Supreme Court had told about NHRC that it is a toothless tiger. It told about NHRC in the context of extrajudicial killings that had happened in Manipur. So Supreme Court told that NHRC is a toothless tiger. So in order to prevent that, we can even think of giving NHRC a constitutional status to make it more stronger and more independent. So all of these way forward you can quote, and you can conclude the answer. Now come to today's question. Discuss the judicial reforms needed in the Indian judiciary. So this again is a 15-marker question which should be answered in 250 words. Do try to make a mental frame of the answers, if not writing a full-fledged answer. So that's it for today. Thank you.